Listeners, readers, welcome to the Fox page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. As some of you may know, we began the week with a deep dive into Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We then were going to continue on with a quick little digest of 3 novels that are essentially derivative of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, but they were so good and so satisfying, each in their own way, that I really needed to dive into each one. And I have to say, I think that I am saving the best for last. Longbourn was the first of these that I had ever read. And honestly, it's been hard to meet that standard. We're going to dig in today to all of the reasons why Longbourn is so amazing. What differentiates Longbourn slightly in my mind is just the quality of the prose. What's beautiful here is we have all of the great things that these Jane Austen spin-offs offer to us, and Jo Baker is really delivering on all of those fronts, but then also delivering some very exceptional prose. I don't think you can say very exceptional. I think it's like very unique, it's just like it's either exceptional or it's not. And let me tell you, this is exceptional. So it does all of these beautiful things like expand the world of the novel, Pride and Prejudice. It allows us to dwell a little longer in Jane Austen's language or something very close to that. It answers questions that the reader doesn't even know that she has, and really does some creative things in terms of plot, fills in maybe some holes that different readers over the centuries have noticed. It's more than 200 years since Pride and Prejudice was published. Good segue into the fact that Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice between the years 1796, I believe, and 1813. So if you recall from the lecture on Monday, most of her publications of those really big books were between the years of sort of 1810 and 1815. It's really important to remember what an absolute trailblazer she was. I mean, this was so early in terms of the sort of literary timeline. So I have just renewed and really very deep respect for Jane Austen. Also today, really need to talk about the respect that I have for Jo Baker. I was thinking earlier that this hat is like totally like Handmaid's Tale meets St. Patrick's Day, and then I put on these orange glasses and now it's just like full Halloween. So it's a very versatile bonnet, it turns out. We are going to look today at what actually makes the prose so great, but it has lots to do with the choice of verbs, actually, which sounds very specific and kind of is, but like not really, and her incredible descriptions of nature, and there's just a lyrical quality that I just cannot get enough of. Longbourn was published in 2013, and that year the New York Times, this made me laugh, it was like one of the 100 best books of 2013. I mean, I think that's the citation. And I was like, I don't know, that just doesn't sound that awesome to me. I mean, it's great. Like, yes, you'd rather be in the best 100. But honestly, I feel like this book could have been on some of those like top 10 books of the year lists. I actually have a review here from the New York Times Book Review. I sometimes will, if I see a book review that's interesting or of a book that I'm reading, I'll rip it out and fold it up and tuck it away in the book. This is by Diane Johnson, who wrote Le Divorce. So I think she's a very wise choice on the part of the New York Times. And she was talking about how most of these kind of sequels or rewritings or reinterpretations of these classics fail. In fact, they are disappointments. And then she says this: "It should be said at once that Jo Baker's Longbourn is an exception. Neither a sequel nor a disappointment, it's an affecting look at the world of Pride and Prejudice, but from another point of view. The servants' hall, where other lives are simultaneously lived with very different concerns and dramas." So it's true. It's really, that is a very apt description of the book. And it seems a little bit obvious, but I think it's pointing to a couple of different things. This is not a sequel. This is much like, Lydia Bennet, Witch. This is sort of simultaneous in some ways with what we are reading in Pride and Prejudice. So those of you who like an agenda, I'll supply you a quick agenda here. We are going to look at the biography of Jo Baker very briefly. We are then going to dive into the text. We'll look at the title and the opening, and very briefly at the dedication. There's a good epigram too, so we'll take a look at that. Then we will take a look at the narrative voice, which departs in some ways from Austen's, but is really, really well done, and actually does one thing that's very important and I think really sort of central to the success of Longbourn. We're then going to talk about the language and the prose. We're going to talk about the incredible nature descriptions, word choice, and a couple of other elements that really make the prose excellent. Then we're going to talk about tension and intrigue and how well Jo Baker is really fostering those things. We're going to talk about her incorporation of history. So those of you who listened to the lecture on Monday know that, in fact, I did not have a good grip on the historical period, but I gained one. And so it was excellent, in fact, to have Jo Baker with Longbourn really expand on that historical piece. So Jo Baker was born in Lancashire in England. Again, that doesn't really mean anything to me, but those of you who know England better than I do, maybe that's significant. She was born in 1973. She's kind of 50-ish. She is the author of 6 different novels. I don't know if this is sort of like her biggest novel, but it's certainly the novel that I know her for. She married Dara Carville, who is an Irish playwright, and they have 2 children. I believe they live in Ireland. She went to Oxford as an undergrad, so obviously a smart cookie, and then moved to Belfast in 1995 in order to pursue her master's degree in Irish literature. Then, in fact, got a PhD. I don't know where that's from exactly, but she did it on Elizabeth Bowen, who is a really interesting writer who we really need to take a look at. Elizabeth Bowen, she's an Irish, English writer who really has some very interesting prose. So it makes good sense to me, in fact, that Jo Baker would have written her dissertation on someone who is really just an incredibly talented prose artist. So now we're going to dive on into the text itself. I love this cover. Oh my God, I just ran the cover into my bonnet. By the way, I don't think this bonnet, talk about anachronistic. I do not think that this bonnet is exactly what someone from the downstairs of Longbourn would be wearing. But I don't know. They don't wear the like little cap things that maybe you only get to wear if you're married. I'm clearly not like a student of the sartorial choices that women were making, or the sartorial impositions that were made upon women at this time. But I was going for it. I figured if I had wigs for the other ones, that I needed to at least, I needed to show up a little bit here for Sarah and the other servants at Longbourn. So I love, oh my God, I have to get out of my own way here. I love this cover. I love it. I love how it's understated. I love the simplicity of it. But it is also significant in the sense that we have this person who, the only person we are seeing here is the servant. It's not like, she's in a bunch of other, in and amongst a bunch of people that she is serving. We see her in this very solitary pose. So we have this understanding that we are going to be focusing on this person, presumably. We also are really given a sense of the Regency era. This is very sort of accurate in terms of what someone would have worn at that time. I love the font. I love everything about this. I love the color. It's really, really very well done. The title, I think, is excellent. So obviously, Longbourn is the name not only of the house that the Bennet girls are not going to, in fact, inherit because it is entailed to Mr. Collins, their cousin, but also it's the name of the village. So this is one of these conventions from the sort of landed gentry that I wasn't totally clear on, but I also learned this recently from The Gentleman, which is this new TV show by Guy Ritchie. Wow, is that good? Woo! But when you have a town, oftentimes you will have the town and then you will have sort of the main house. And that house, in fact, will be given the name of the town. You can imagine that, like, really a long time ago, when it was really seriously like serfs and whatnot, that you would have had, essentially these are the people who are employed by the big house. Longbourn, it's certainly a larger house and they are certainly well off, but these are not, they're not so much of the aristocracy. The Bennets really need to marry off their daughters and they have some financial woes, but, are also, in fact, very comfortable people. So I love the title in part because it really does encompass the entire world, and it really reminds us, obviously, that this is really very, firmly situated in the universe of Pride and Prejudice. But I also love the idea of what this word is saying. So if something is being born, that idea, like you have to, it's sort of like bearing your cross almost. A lot of the servants here have no choice but to sort of bear what it is, and something can be long born in the sense that she has long borne her suffering or her responsibility or whatever it is. So I love that idea. And also, weirdly, I like the resonance of born here, because honestly, so much of this stuff, contrary to what a lot of people would like to believe, is just so contingent on the accident of birth. I mean, Sarah is born here, into this world. I mean, it's occurring to me right now that she doesn't even have a last name. She's like an orphan, who was taken from the poorhouse by Mrs. Hill. But you have this sense of her as being born for no good reason into an impoverished servitude. And then you have someone like Elizabeth Bennet, who happens to be born into this other reality entirely, as opposed to, say, Mr. Collins, who is born into a different one. A lot of that is societal, certainly, but I'm a big believer in the accident of birth. So I like, in fact, this emphasis here on born. Some of you are thinking like, wait, I don't think Jo Baker really thought of all those nuances, and maybe not, but a really solid title. And actually, knowing her, I mean, the book is so good, and the attention to the prose and word choice is so good that these nuances may, in fact, have occurred to her. I just think it's an excellent title. Okay, then we're going to move on. We're going to open up the book, and we have this dedication for Claire with thanks for her attention, forbearance, patience. So I don't know who this Claire is. I did some sleuthing. Couldn't really come up with much. Then we move on to what is essentially an epigraph. It has no attribution, so we don't really know where this came from, but any astute reader and anyone who picks this up because they are interested in Jane Austen would, in fact, get the tone and the verbiage, and they would be like, oh, okay, this is probably from the novel. It says this: "What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant?" So I love this. I love the question. I love the emphasis of the intelligent servant. I love everything about it. I actually really also like the fact, I found it intriguing that it was not attributed to anyone. And I like the fact that this italicized epigraph in the beginning is in fact the first of many of these epigraphs that we'll see. In fact, one is before every single chapter. Some of them ring a bell a little more than others, but all of them are taken verbatim from Pride and Prejudice, which is a really clever and very efficient and really a very, I think, a very smart way to ground us in the world of the novel. Okay, then we're going to move on to Volume 1. Anyone who's listened to the Fox page for a while will remember that I'm a big believer in really paying attention to the first couple of paragraphs, partially because it's just fun. It's like doing like a little Sudoku or crossword or something where you're paying just a little bit more attention. But I really am a believer that really focusing here, especially if it's a difficult text, but this text is not particularly difficult. It's very rich and beautiful, but it's not like, we're not trying to read like Ulysses or something here. But it does do a good job of focusing us toward the different things that we will be looking for in the text. And it also is giving us some good clues to the ways in which Jo Baker is going to depart from Jane Austen's model in Pride and Prejudice. So, okay, we're going to take a look at Chapter 1. The epigraph reads, "The butler, Mrs. Hill, and the two housemaids." So I like the idea here with this epigraph of her really grounding us in the world of the novel and understanding that there are not very many players. The footman is mentioned one time. The note at the end of the novel, in fact, alerts us to that, and she really expanded all of these characters, but she is staying true to the original cast of the servants who were at Longbourn. And then we're going to wade into this beautiful prose. "There could be no wearing of clothes without their laundering, just as surely as there could be no going without clothes, not in Hertfordshire anyway, and not in September. Wash day could not be avoided, but the weekly purification of the household's linen was none the less a dismal prospect for Sarah." So I love this. It's beginning with a bit of one of these kind of pronouncements, very much like, it is a truth universally acknowledged. It's not quite that kind of abstract and authoritative and removed. It's a truth, this idea there could be no wearing of clothes without their laundering. It's about as true as Jane Austen's, as her proclamation. But we have this idea of sort of like beginning with a truth and then moving toward this one character, Sarah. Another little tip for those of you who are wanting to learn to read better, or just, read more richly and get more out of what you're reading, it's always a good idea to think about what word comes at the end of a sentence and certainly at the end of a paragraph or a chapter. So there's just a sort of physiological thing that happens when we're reading where we're moving along, we have our momentum, and then we stop at the end. And so we have this kind of very brief moment, sometimes if it's just the gap between a period and the next sentence. But even that small gap allows us to sort of linger a little bit on that word. And certainly if it's a chapter break or even a paragraph break, your mind is able to sort of retain that word a little longer than what has come before it. Also, we're moving with a certain amount of momentum toward something. And so there is this sense of having arrived when we get to that last word. And I mention all of that because here we are ending with Sarah. So the linen day was nonetheless a dismal prospect for Sarah. So you'll note here, this is a third-person narrator, just like we have in Jane Austen. And in fact, it's fairly removed. It begins much more removed, just like Jane Austen does. And then we move closer to this one person, Sarah. You will note, too, that right from the beginning, we're using first names. It's not Mrs. Bennet. It's not Mr. Bennet. In fact, we are talking about Sarah. It's very much like a first, well, it's not, because they use a lot of formality within the hierarchy of the servants. But this Sarah is kind of, she's not the lowest of the bunch. She's not Polly, who's very young, who's like 12 or 13. In fact, Polly doesn't even know her age, because she's an orphan and grew up in the poorhouse. So, and yuckily, the reason we know that is because Wickham at some point asks her, and he's been so predatory and gross, this is later in the novel, that in fact, when she says she's 12 or 13, you're like, oh my God. But I'm going to let you discover what happens with that when you get there. Okay, I'm going to continue on. The air was sharp at 4:30 in the morning when she started work. The iron pump handle was cold, and even with her mitts on, chilblains flared as she heaved the water up from the underground dark and into her waiting pail. A long day to be got through, and this was just the very start of it. All else was stillness. So one of the things we're going to take a look at is the way that this novel, in fact, feels much more like a realist novel than it does like a Regency novel. And you might keep in mind this level of detail. We have an idea here of what the pump handle feels like and how it is that you would pump water and what time in the morning you would go out to do these things. There's much more detail here in Longbourn than we see in Pride and Prejudice, and that is very much a hallmark of a slightly later literary movement, which is realism, which would have come after the Regency novel. So we're going to continue. All else was stillness. Sheep huddled in drifts on the hillside, birds in the hedgerows were fluffed like thistledown. In the woods, fallen leaves rustled with the passage of a hedgehog. The stream caught starlight and glistened over rocks. So I'm not going to read the entire paragraph, but one of the things that she does so well in this book is describe nature. And it's this incredibly inventive language, and a lot of it is almost like onomatopoeia, which is just that fancy Greek word for saying that things sound like what they are. So you have this really beautiful evocation of nature using all five senses and certainly using language. So we're going to go down a little further. Below in the barn, cows huffed clouds of sweet breath, and in the sty the sow twitched, her piglets bundled at her belly. Mrs. Hill and her husband, up high in their tiny attic, slept the black, blank sleep of deep fatigue. 2 floors below, in the principal bedchamber, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet were a pair of churchyard humps under their counterpane. The young ladies, all 5 of them sleeping in their beds, were dreaming of whatever it was that young ladies dream. This is so beautiful, and these glasses are so hideous, but This is what we've got going today. So it's just an absolutely beautiful way to alert us to this hierarchy. We are beginning, Sarah is the only one who's awake at 4:30 in the morning, and we very quickly learn about Mr. and Mrs. Hill way up in the attic. And then this idea of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet being churchyard humps. So essentially what she's talking about is the grave, so that they're almost, they're old is the idea that we are supposed to be getting, and they're in sort of their twilight, which, honestly, they're probably like in their mid 40s or something, which in 1800, would be your twilight for sure. But these days, that's like a baby, And then we have this idea of the 5 girls all sleeping. And this is the beautiful turn that happens again and again throughout this novel, which is that Sarah has no idea what the 5 daughters would be dreaming about because their lives are so incredibly different. So one of the really masterful pieces of the novel is the way that Joe Baker is constantly reminding us of the division between the upstairs and the downstairs, or, the owners of the house and their servants. So you're constantly reminded in these really beautiful and very subtle ways of those divisions and how important they would have been. It's such a great opening. Before we move on to talk about narrative stance, I want to just point out a couple of other differences here between Longbourn and Pride and Prejudice. Right from the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, you have, first of all, this narrator who does a lot of telling, so it's making proclamations, but also telling us what is happening, who's the youngest, who's the oldest, what the circumstances of the girls are, the fact that the house is entailed. All of that is information that is simply told in very plain terms to the reader. And then we have lots and lots of dialogue. It's absolutely genius dialogue in Jane Austen. She is so incredibly good at it. And part of the reason it's so good is because it reveals so much about the people who are speaking. She needs to give hardly any other information because the dialogue is so rich. But there's lots and lots and lots of it. It's kind of amazing when you look even at just the format of the pages in Pride and Prejudice. By contrast, Longbourn, in fact, doesn't do quite as much of the kind of telling. In fact, there's a lot more that is put into scene, meaning that we are, here we are, with Sarah at 4:30 in the morning, and she has these chilblains, and it's freezing cold, and everyone else is sleeping, and she has no idea how they dream. All of that is very much in scene to show us the division between the servants and the owners of the house. So you have this idea of really departing in some ways from Jane Austen. That's actually a perfect segue into a slightly more robust discussion of the narrative stance. So we talked before about Pride and Prejudice, about how it's this very nimble, omniscient third-person narrator who can sometimes be, very, very far back and making big pronouncements, or it can be very close to the consciousness of a person. It's never saying, I did this, I did that. It's always in the third person, but it does in fact get very close, and we are given a good sense of how different people are thinking and feeling because the narrator is very close to them. So in many ways, this is also the same. We have certainly a third person narrator. It is not like, the scandalous confessions of Lydia Bennet Witch. It is not first person. It is all third person. And it only very, very rarely enters into the consciousness of a person, but it is a narrator who is giving us much, much more detail. So it's much more of a realist narrator in the sense that this is a narrator who's much more concerned with small details and with showing us what is happening and not so much kind of telling us what is happening. So that is one major difference. There's also the dialogue in Longbourn is excellent. It's really good, and Joe Baker uses it pretty sparingly, but when she does, it really does tell us an enormous amount about the people, which is really the whole point of dialogue. So there's certainly less dialogue than you would see in Jane Austen, but it's really very good. So this discussion of narrative stance is actually the perfect way to think about realism. Realism is essentially between 1850 and 1900. It sort of started in France after their revolution of 1848. Madame Bovary is kind of it's known, canonically as like the finest of the realist novels, and it's also one of the first. And it was published in 1856. So the whole kind of premise of realism is that the author is trying to give the reader the entire world. Flaubert had something about how he wanted to have, Madame Bovary's entire world be revealed to the reader. And that meant the inclusion of many, many more details, but it was also a bit of a democratic seems kind of weird to say that, but it was sort of a democratic move in the sense that we were going to be looking at an echelon of people at the sort of lower middle class and not necessarily just this kind of aristocracy, even if the aristocracy in Pride and Prejudice is sort of, the Bennets are kind of lower. They do not have like a title or anything, and they're certainly doing fine and they're comfortable, but they're sort of this waning, gentry, this waning landed gentry class. So Madame Bovary is a little bit lower, and so it's this idea of wanting to look at all of the different classes. And in fact, in realism, part of all of these details that the writer will provide are very intimate details that are meant to give a much more broad and a much more democratic, and I'm saying democratic in like the sense of like having to do with a lot of people, not political. So this very democratic thing is like, you want to tell your reader like how these people eat and what they eat and where they sleep and where they use the bathroom and sort of more, honestly, like kind of more like gross stuff. So there is a lot of detail that is just really excellent detail here that really puts us very accurately in scene in Longbourn, but there's also some of this very kind of realist detail that was really interesting to me. We're going to look on page 18. This is fairly early on. This is the beginning of chapter 3, and this is Sarah. I don't have to tell you it's Sarah because the omniscient narrator will tell you. Sarah carried a chamber pot down from the Bennets' room, crossing the landing towards the narrow back stairs. She went carefully, head turned aside. Just night water, thankfully, not the dreadful slopping thunk of solids. That is like really a pretty graphic and pretty amazing description. So there is a lot happening here. First of all, the idea of chamber pots is really telling us exactly how people, at the turn of the 19th century were in fact using the bathroom. There was something called the necessary house. Like at one point, James has to shovel out the necessary house. And that's a very good example of this kind of, Jane Austen would have maybe mentioned the necessary house, maybe. I don't know, like even that might be like a bridge too far for Jane. But certainly you have this kind of word. It's not even outhouse. Outhouse is probably like American. But you have this idea of language also that is very sanitized. And here language is not in fact sanitized. Here she's talking about the thunk of solids. She's not saying like, shit or something, but in fact, she's giving us in some ways like a more graphic description of feces. So I also think it's very important that we have this picture of the house that is all the sort of the back stairs and how things function and the different fires and the different places. And so you get literally like the behind the scenes view of these homes that you certainly would not have gotten from Jane Austen. Okay, then we're going to look at page 103. So this is an excellent example of the details of the lives and sort of the jobs and how things were done in this era. I found this stuff fascinating. There's descriptions of how she makes soap. There are descriptions of how they use tea to put on the floors in order to gather the dust. All of this different dried tea, not wet tea. But they have all of these different descriptions of how you could clean things and how things were done in this era that were really fascinating. It doesn't sound fascinating, but it absolutely was. Okay, on 103, we have this. Sarah, having fetched the girls in from their walk, now hung up the cloaks and laid the ladies' bonnets carefully on the cloakroom dresser. She ran an ostrich feather through her fingers, touched a rosebud of vermilion silk. So here, of course, you have this idea of her wanting these things and barely being able to touch them. But also you have this incredible tactile sense. We're going to talk about the prose, but one of the best things is this use of all five senses. But also this idea of like laying the bonnets out carefully and doing all of these different things. We're figuring out what her job is all about. A little further down, the Bingley coach was waiting for its owner, the coachman sliding down from his seat to check some aspect of the harness. The footmen were round the back, standing at their ease, talking and sharing a cigarillo. So here we have another example of what the footmen would be getting up to while in fact all of these visits in Pride and Prejudice are going on. And again, I found this really interesting. Sarah in many ways is she's not the only protagonist, but in fact she in some ways really is the character that we are focusing on. Although we really learn a lot about Mrs. Hill, we learn a lot about a lot of these characters, but I would argue that Sarah certainly is the main character, and then Mrs. Hill is kind of a close second. Okay, and then we have this a bit further down. She felt the gravel crunch beneath her feet. She felt, too, the shush of her skirts around her ankles, the press of her stays, the tickle of a curl at the back of her neck. So again, very tactile, but you also have this idea of just giving the reader details of the fact that she would be wearing, I mean, this seems fairly obvious just from what we have seen of this era, but, she'd be wearing a full length, very full skirt, and, lots of things would be gravel in order to not have mud everywhere, although there are great descriptions of mud throughout the entire book. And this idea of stays, that she, even as a servant, she would have had, very tight clothing that would have really held her in a way that would have been kind of constraining. So I really just loved all of these different details. The last one we're going to look at is on page 297. So this was one that I was like, oh my God, wait, can we bring back this tradition? Which is this. It's very subtle, and lots of these examples are, which is part of what makes them so genius. The narrator says, Mrs. B's nightgown was warming at the dressing room fire, and in the adjoining bedchamber, Mrs. Hill had already turned back the bed. So first of all, I was like, wait, can we go back to warming our pajamas? Like, oh my God, how delicious would that be? But I also think it's important to note here, for example, when we have Mrs. B's nightgown, it's not, in fact, quite the omniscient narrator. This is language that would have been used by either Sarah or Mrs. Hill. In this case, it was likely Sarah. But this is a very good example of this nimble third person, very much like Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice, who can use the language of whoever is speaking in order to give us a sense of who this person is. The last thing I will say about this third person omniscient narrator and its ability to sort of go into, or at least get very close to, the consciousness of all of these different characters is that it's also doing sort of a larger thing, which is very important, which is that when this narrator is moving around in our different characters, the narrator is in fact staying below stairs, as it were. So this narrator has all this information, and it gets again very close to the consciousness of the servants, but never enters, or not never, but like very, very infrequently enters into the consciousness of the people upstairs, which really is this amazing way that this division is really brought to the fore. And I don't think that that's like a really conscious decision, or maybe it is, but it's really interesting to know that like there's no way that this narrator can know both of the things, both of the worlds, because in fact these worlds are so divided. It also makes you realize that in Jane Austen, in Pride and Prejudice, we have a very nimble third person omniscient narrator who's popping in and out of all these different people's minds, essentially, to tell us their thoughts. Even, in the same paragraph, it's a very nimble narrator, but it does not enter, in fact, into the minds of the servants, again, at least not very often. So we have this division that we weren't even really aware of. And again, it has to do with agency, and it has to do with division of labor, but it's really, really well reflected in this narrative voice. Now that we have discussed the ways that this novel is a bit more realist than it is like the Regency novels that Jane Austen is such an amazing example of, we're going to move on and talk about what it is that makes this prose just so incredibly rich and really so rewarding to read. So the first thing that she does really well that we're going to look at is this idea of using all five senses. I can tell you from my 3/4 of an MFA from Bennington College that one of the things that really works well and is a real gift to your reader is the idea of evoking something with all five senses. So of course you're going to have the sounds and you're going to have what they are seeing, but if you can also include things like smell and tactile sensations, you're really going to enrich whatever scene you are describing. So this is Sarah talking about a certain workday. It had been that unfortunate time of the month when all the women in the house had been more than usually short-tempered, clumsy, and prone to tears, and then had bled. I mean, see, again, this is that great realist kind of detail here where Jane Austen's not talking about all of these young women menstruating, but in fact, here we have a very good sense of like how the house would feel and it, not in like a glamorous way, but just like everybody clumsy, which I didn't know that's a thing with PMS. But imagining a house full of 6 women who are all, having PMS symptoms is like, it's really something to consider. Even more kind of impressive in some ways is the idea of Sarah having to launder all of these things. I'm assuming they use these sort of cotton rags or whatever that she has in this bucket here. It's also very hot on this particular day. And so you have this, again, this real sense of senses being engaged. So the next, a little ways down, we have this. Sarah huffed a sigh and plucked at the seam under her arm. She had already sweated through her dress, which she hated. So I love this language here. She huffed a sigh and plucked at the seam. So you get that sense of just like, ugh, like that, just like, ugh, it's so hot and I have to do this thing I don't want to be doing. I love that idea. And the verbs, which we're about to talk about, are just incredible. Such a good way to really engage us in the scene and all of our senses. So here we also are appreciating the heat, which is not something that we have really, rich depictions of in Austen. But here we really are sensing it because she's, sweating through her dress and she's plucking at her clothes. I mean, she's just pretty miserable. Down a little further. She only wore the dress now because her other dress, a mousy linsey woolsey, had been sponged and dabbed and was patchy wet and hanging on the line to air the piggy stink out of it. Another thing that she does that I really love is she makes a lot of nouns into adjectives simply by adding a Y. So for example, the piggy stink, piggy is also just a plain old adjective. But this idea of how it was patchy wet. So you have these verbs and you have these adjectives that she's using in sort of unusual ways that really are describing very clearly what these things are. But the idea of the piggy stink and the use of the word stink instead of smell, stink is just much more like it almost gives you that like sense of how it would feel in your nose, that like piquant smell. And then this idea too of something being sponged and dabbed. So those are verbs that are really, they're past participles. They're verbs that are really sponging something and dabbing it is really giving you a sense. It almost sounds like what the thing is, and sponging it. You have this really tactile sense there. Then Mrs. Hill says, "Dump them shifts in next. You stir for a bit and I'll scrub." So we have this idea here of dump them shifts in next. First of all, we're hearing a certain amount of dialect here. Dump them shifts in next. We have the way that Mrs. Hill would speak. So we have our sound is engaged because we are hearing, in fact, the voice of someone here. But also dump them in, you could almost hear them falling in. So not only do we have the voice and dialect, but we also have this very evocative verb here that really is mimicking the sound of what they would all sound like, kind of dumping into the tub. And then this idea of you stir for a bit and I'll scrub. Stirring and scrubbing are really, again, almost sort of onomatopoetic in the sense that they sound like what they are. Then a little further down, she stepped back from the copper to the duck boards by the sink, stood aside to let Polly pass. Then she scooped a neckcloth out of the starch with the laundry tongs and watched its jellied drip back into the bowl. So here, duck boards, by the way, I had to look that up. Those are like little slats that you would put over a floor. You would stand on them, so that you would not be standing in wetness. But you can almost feel, if I knew what they were without looking them up, you can feel that they would be like a little wobbly, not wobbly, but they would sort of move underfoot. And also this idea that there's water on the floor because it's laundry day. You have the sense of really what is happening in that space. And then the idea of she scooped a neckcloth out. So you have this idea of scooping again, which is very onomatopoetic. And then the idea of and watched its jellied drip back into the bowl. So this idea of the jellied drip, you can see the way that the starch, it would have a jellied drip. Again, it's that sense of really evoking things through sound. But here we also have a sense of like what that would feel like. So this last part is she's talking about she had slipped in the hog leavings. And so she has to take off her dress and she has to wash it out because, in fact, she has hog shit all over her dress. Sarah's not having a great day, really, at the beginning of the novel here. A little further down, wasn't the fault in the person who had let the sty's gate latch get slack so that a good snouty nudge was all it took to open it? But this idea of the gate latch slack, You have that slack of the gate latch. You have this idea of exactly the sound that it might make, which is so, so good. So she's an absolute master at engaging all five senses, which is really not easy to do without it feeling heavy handed. The next thing I want to take a look at is her descriptions of the natural world. These are just absolutely breathtaking. So on 37, this is a little bit long, but you can think about some of the things that I have been talking about, and also just revel in this prose and me reading out loud to you. The drover's road was ancient. It swept along the ridge and was not surfaced or shaped like the modern roads were, with their gravel and their ditches. The drover's road was just a ribbon of grass worn short by the passing of the herds. The openness, the prospect here were striking. You could see steeples, villages, woods, and copses miles away, and the smooth distance of far hills. And she knew that if she just turned that way and kept on walking long enough, she'd end up at the first city of all the world. She wrapped her arms around herself. A curlew cried. The sun nudged itself up above the hills, flushing the blue morning through with orange. A sheep called. A lamb replied. Shadows reeled out like ribbon. There was green now in the meadows and on the trees. Somewhere off down the valley, a cockerel crew, and there was a whiff of wood smoke on the air. And at Longbourn, the kettle should be filled and put on to heat, because soon enough everybody would need a cup of tea. So it's just so beautiful. You have figurative language here. You have some personification. You have some really beautiful evocations of the sounds of the birds. It's just visually and sonically and in all ways just an absolute delight. Speaking of the way things sound, I did a cute little exercise where I went ahead and I wrote down all of the verbs at the beginning of this book because I was so impressed by her word choice. And then it occurred to me that I should do the same in Pride and Prejudice, which I went ahead and did. And it was so interesting. So I'm just going to read you this list of all of these crazy verbs that Jo Baker uses. This is actually a very good point. Anyone out there who's trying to be a writer, and also those of you who want to read more richly, you always want to choose a very strong verb, and you almost never want to have an adverb. So a strong, strong verb is just an enormous foundation for all sorts of things in any sentence or paragraph. And she has the best verbs. Okay, here they are. Lugged, trudged, dawdled, billowed, tugged, dragged, flumped, clattered, bobbed, clambered, mustered, churned, struggled, washed, whisked, hacked, stitched, picked, unpicked, swept, heaved, washed. So I love so many of these because they sound so much like what they are saying. And taken all together, you really do get the sense of like what their lives were like. It's all like trudging and sweeping, which are very different feelings, but you have this sense of especially the words like lug and drag and trudge. You have all of these low vowels and all of these these consonant clusters that are really giving us a sense of the sort of drudgery that in fact they are needing to engage in. So we have then all of these verbs that, interestingly, it's, again, so much dialogue in Jane Austen, but we have these verbs in contrast at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice. Said, cried, returned, fancied, addressed, assured, employed, deigned, stared, wished, expected, dispatched, attacked, eluded, obliged. And then we have all of these verbs that are actually in the present tense because these are verbs that are spoken by people in dialogue. And they are also really interesting. Consented, pretend, declare, draw, and crown. So I think it's very cool to look at these side by side and to compare things, like assured or employed or deigned with things like trudge and lug, more sort of like, low voweled, grunty kind of words. Grunty, by the way, not a linguistic term, but you got my sense. So I thought it was so interesting. And also just to look in Jane Austen at how much dialogue there is and how many of those verbs have to do with voice. We are really hearing the voices of all of these people, which is no small feat because, in fact, hearing the voices of these people alerts us to the fact that there are people whose voices are heard. In Pride and Prejudice, there's so much dialogue because these people really get to speak all the time. And by contrast, the people at Longbourn, who are the servants, in fact, don't get to say a lot and honestly are probably so tired after their long work days, a lot of it's solitary, that they in fact wouldn't want to be chit-chatting with someone and certainly don't have, the ability or the place to really use their voices. So it's a very interesting thing because it's pointing to the idea, in fact, that everybody upstairs has voices that they can use and everyone downstairs, in fact, is much quieter, in fact, almost sort of silenced. The last thing I want to do with the prose is just read a couple of sentences that are really good examples of how inventive Baker is with the different ways that she modifies words. Lots of times it's that thing where she's adding a Y to the end, and she does it again and again, and it's really effective. Also, just keep in mind the fact that a lot of these words, again, are sort of onomatopoetic in the sense that they really are, I think that's how you say that. That when I say onomatopoetic, it might be onomatopoeish. I don't know. Onomatopoeic? I don't know how you would say that. But my point is, onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like what it is, or sounds like what is describing. A word like knock. It's very close to the sound of something actually knocking. So a lot of these verbs that she is using, and a lot of the nouns, in fact, are really evoking the sounds that these things actually make or the kind of emotional tone of those things. It's really one of the strengths of her prose. So I want to read a few examples. The stuff was hammy, jellied with melting bits of brain and unexpected crunch. That was one of the things poor Sarah was having to eat. But this idea of hammy, something was hammy with a jellied bits of brain, I mean, yikes. Okay, then we have thick with growth, mulchy and warm. So this is of some sort of greenery outside, but the idea of something being mulchy and warm, you can just absolutely feel what that is. It makes me think of like compost or like a hay pile where you have that kind of warmth that comes from, like things breaking down. But that idea of mulchy is such an excellent adjective there. Then we have, she flumped down on the floorboards. I mean, flumped. Flumped is, she's making up this word here. A flump, to flump is not really like a standard verb, but this idea of somebody flumping down, in fact, it's Sarah. You can see the way that her dresses would that her skirts would kind of billow as she's doing that. But you also have this sense of her as just being the end of her rope. She's like flumping down because she just does not have any more energy. And then we can move on. She smoothed the rumpled counterpane. This is so good because this is a relatively like normal sentence. This is not so much inventive language, but the idea of smoothing something that is rumpled, I mean, it's so good because smoothing sounds like what it is, and then rumpled also sounds like what it is. So you have this idea of smoothing out this rumpled counterpane. Counterpane? Oh yeah. Counterpane is, it's like a bedspread. So, but this idea of smoothing something rumpled it's so good. Okay, and then we move on a bit. So just incredible prose, largely because of these incredible descriptions of nature, her crazy modifications of all sorts of different words, and this idea of how well she engages all of the different senses. We're going to touch very briefly on the incredible tension that Jo Baker is bringing to this novel. She's doing that thing that we have seen in the other adaptations, where she's essentially sort of answering these questions that we didn't even know we had, and she's also, of course, expanding on some of the sort of, the beginnings of plot points, and really taking advantage of the cast of characters. But there is so much suspense. So one of the things right away is there's a very mysterious relationship, a very strange connection between Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, and Mr. Bennet. And we learn about that relatively early on, and it's really beautifully kind of spun out almost throughout the entire course of the novel. It's really well done and really sort of modifies the novel in a way that is very interesting. I'm not going to give anything away here. We also have this question of Sarah. She has a couple of different love interests as the novel develops. And there's this real question of like, is she going to go with the bad boy or is she going to go like with the nice guy? And there's also some really beautiful evolution of those people. The structure of the book, too, is such that we have this whole backstory. It actually is a really good look at the Napoleonic Wars. But we have this whole backstory of one of the characters, and it's very taut. And there's a lot of tension in that backstory. But it's really, really beautifully done and very tense in lots of ways. And one of the tensions that is very palpable in Pride and Prejudice, this question of whether or not Mr. Collins is going to sort of turn them all out and live by himself in Longbourn, is really, it's the same tension, but you all of a sudden realize what that would mean for the servants. And it's explained to you, and lots of, things are sort of hinging on this question of how Mr. Collins is going to feel about the servants. So Joe Baker is doing this beautiful job of both incorporating things that are already in the novel and then also, really expanding the world in ways that are inventive and I think really creative and interesting. The very last element we're going to touch on is this idea of history. So I did not know this, but apparently Jane Austen was criticized, maybe at the time, was criticized for not having incorporated the Napoleonic Wars enough, which is ridiculous. That's like, you're writing a book about gardening and they're like, wait, why aren't you talking about the automobile? It's apples and oranges to a certain degree. And we have the militia. I mean, I feel like the war is, somewhat palpable. Anyway, that is a criticism that people have leveled on poor Jane. And in fact, Joe Baker really does an amazing job of addressing that. So we have, in fact, one of the characters heading back. We go back in time and we have, very nicely labeled years. We have 1808 and 1809. So this is in the heart of the Napoleonic Wars. And this part of the book, in fact, happens in Portugal and in Spain, which he had a whole campaign down there, Napoleon did, as he was trying to take over Europe. And in fact, Britain really was very present in that conflict, sent a lot of people down there. So you have this sense of not only of the Napoleonic Wars, but wow, is Joe Baker really, really great at evoking Spain and Portugal. And in fact, the gruesomeness of war. I mean, there's some really, it's not like violent and like graphic or anything, but she does an excellent job of again giving us a lot of tension, and a lot of the questions in the front story are addressed by this beautiful passage of time in these couple of chapters that are very historical, and actually also I felt like I learned a lot, which who doesn't want to learn a lot, especially about the Napoleonic Wars. As an American, I feel like that was we were woefully undereducated. Although, what am I saying? I don't know. We were woefully undereducated about a lot of important things. So I want to finish up by just thanking you for joining me. And really, I if you're going to read one of the three of these novels, I would definitely read Longbourn. No offense to the other two, but it is just so well done and it's so delicious. And in some ways, it feels the most different. That's not true. That's not actually true. But the prose, in some ways, is a really interesting departure, and it is just an absolutely beautiful volume. It truly stands alone. You do not, in fact, have to have read Pride and Prejudice to love this book, although I will say that you will love it even more if you, in fact, know the source material. So thank you very much for listening and for tuning in, and head straight back to the Foxed page and listen to something else. Happy reading!